Hey everyone, I need to get something off my chest that's been brewing since my wedding day a few weeks ago. The main character in this story? My younger brother Nick, who somehow turned what should have been a day celebrating my wife and me into his own little soap opera. But I'll get to that part. For some background, I'm Jake, 28, and my wife Amy and I recently tied the knot after being together since high school. I have a brother Nick who's 26 and has been dating Riley for the last 5 years. Riley and I actually go way back to college days, and we've been good friends ever since. That's how Nick and Riley met in the first place. Now, to say that Nick has a bit of a golden child thing going on would be an understatement. Our parents doted on him growing up, and Nick, well, let's just say he's always liked the spotlight. While I'm not sure if it's intentional, Nick has made a habit of turning every important event of mine into something about him. I should have known that my wedding day would be no different. The day started out beautifully. Amy looked stunning, and we were surrounded by friends and family. The ceremony was perfect, and I was actually starting to think we might pull off a day focused on us. Then came the reception. As Amy and I were making our rounds to greet guests, I noticed Nick and Riley off to the side, looking a bit intense. Before I knew it, Nick was down on one knee, proposing to Riley in front of all our guests. I was caught off guard and didn't know how to react. It felt surreal, like, is this really happening? I glanced at Amy, and she was just as shocked, but she gave me a look that said, "Let's not cause a scene." So we stayed quiet and waited for Riley's response. That's when things took an unexpected turn. Riley didn't cry tears of joy or say yes with a big smile. Instead, she looked at Nick in shock, then turned toward the stage and asked for the microphone. As she took the mic, she apologized to Amy and me, saying she'd hoped to save this for later and avoid any drama at our wedding. But since Nick had put her on the spot, she had no choice but to clear the air. What came next was something none of us saw coming. Riley revealed that Nick had been cheating on her with one of his co-workers, and she'd found out just a week before the wedding. She explained that she hadn't confronted him about it sooner because she didn't want to cause drama before our big day. She knew Nick would love nothing more than to steal the spotlight if given the chance, and she didn't want to give him that satisfaction. But here he was, doing exactly that, and Riley decided enough was enough. She continued, saying that she realized Nick's proposal was nothing more than a desperate attempt to make my wedding about himself. She knew he didn't genuinely love her. He just wanted the attention and to stir things up. She looked directly at him and said she couldn't accept his proposal. Not because she was too heartbroken, but because she deserved someone who actually valued her. She walked up to Amy and me, hugged us, apologized again, and then made a dramatic exit, leaving everyone stunned. For a moment, the entire reception was dead silent. No one quite knew how to react. Nick looked like he'd been hit by a truck, standing there in shock as people whispered and murmured. My parents, who practically worshipped him, rushed to comfort him as if he were the victim. Meanwhile, our guests were all confused and uneasy, trying to figure out how to react. I won't lie, it wasn't the wedding reception I'd envisioned. Amy and I were left picking up the pieces, trying to salvage the day and shift the focus back to our celebration. Our bridesmaids and groomsmen helped get things back on track, serving food and encouraging everyone to carry on with the festivities. In a way, it was hilarious and ridiculous, a story that no one there would forget, that's for sure. But we managed to laugh it off, knowing this would be a wedding to remember for everyone. In the aftermath, I thought maybe I was finally free of Nick's antics. I figured, okay, karma finally served him his due, but that was wishful thinking. The next day, I started getting texts from my parents, essentially blaming me for what had happened. They insisted that I reach out to Riley and convince her to give Nick another chance. They argued that since it happened at my wedding, I had a responsibility to help fix it. They acted like it was my job to repair Nick's relationship, even though I wasn't the one who caused the mess. Amy and I tried to brush it off, but the texts kept coming. My parents were relentless, saying that I owed it to the family to step in and make things right. When I didn't respond, they began calling from random numbers, even reaching out on social media. It was exhausting. I couldn't even enjoy being a newlywed because my parents were obsessed with trying to control the fallout from Nick's latest disaster. So, after a few days of this harassment, I decided to reach out to Riley. I sent her a message letting her know that I respected her decision and that I was proud of her for standing up for herself. I reassured her that while it caused a bit of chaos at the wedding, I knew she'd done what she felt was right. I even took a screenshot of my message to Riley and sent it to my parents, letting them know that I was not going to interfere on Nick's behalf. I told them they needed to respect my decision to stay out of it and that they should stop trying to involve me. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next morning I woke up to a lengthy email from Nick. In it, he went on and on about how he's always been insecure around me because he feels like I'm constantly overshadowing him. He confessed that he's always seen me as competition, that our parents favoured him because they sensed his insecurity, and that it made him feel validated. He tried to explain that the proposal was his way of finally stepping out of my shadow. He even had the nerve to say that, given the situation, I could have just ignored my parents' pleas rather than messaging Riley and making things worse for him. He ended by saying that even though he knew he'd messed up, he felt that my actions were unnecessarily hurtful. Reading it, I didn't feel pity or sympathy, just a sense of disbelief. He still couldn't grasp that his proposal, especially with his history of cheating, was not just a mistake. It was selfish, manipulative, and downright tacky. It was clear to me that Nick wasn't sorry for his actions. He was just upset that they'd backfired. So, here I am, trying to sort out how I feel about all this. Part of me feels justified, like Riley deserved to know that she did the right thing. But another part of me wonders if I've gone too far by getting involved at all. I genuinely want to support her, but now I'm facing backlash from my family, who seem more concerned with protecting Nick than addressing what he did. I'm feeling torn about whether I should have kept my message to Riley to myself, or whether it's time I finally stop catering to my family's unreasonable demands. So here we are, a week after my wedding, and my parents are still at it. After sending that screenshot to them, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd get the hint. But no, my parents are now angrier than ever, and they've switched gears, going from guilt-tripping to full-on manipulation. They keep saying I've brought shame to the family by not helping my brother. My mom even went so far as to say that I'm driving a wedge in the family by taking Riley's side over Nick's. In their minds, Riley's outburst was uncalled for, and if I had any respect for my family, I'd make it right, Dot. The thing is, they're not even hearing me out. Every time I've tried to explain that Riley did what she had to do, and that Nick brought this all on himself, they brush me off. My parents keep pushing the idea that Riley's actions hurt our family's reputation. This whole idea of reputation is laughable to me because, honestly, it's not like we're some high-profile family in town. Most people probably forgot about the drama the day after the wedding. But to my parents, it's become this big issue, like people are going to judge them forever because of Nick's little stunt. Yesterday, my dad even went as far as to show up unannounced at my house. He was trying to be all civil about it, sitting me down and saying we needed to find a way to mend the family before things got worse. When I asked him how, he suggested I reach out to Riley again and tell her that her actions had serious consequences and that she should apologize to Nick for causing him public embarrassment. The nerve of it almost made me laugh, but I kept my cool and told him I wasn't going to do that. He looked shocked, like I'd just insulted him personally. He tried to throw more guilt my way, saying things like, "You and Nick are brothers. Family sticks together no matter what." I told him that Nick and I are brothers, yes, but that doesn't mean I'll excuse his behavior, especially when it hurts other people. My dad went silent for a moment, then mumbled something about me being cold-hearted. I just walked him to the door and told him that if they couldn't respect my boundaries, I'd have to cut contact for a while. I thought that would end it, but I should have known better. That same evening, Nick sent me another email, and this one was even longer than the first. He went on about how he felt abandoned and how our parents are the only ones supporting him right now. He kept saying that as his big brother, I should understand his side, that he didn't mean to cause problems. Then he added a line that honestly infuriated me. "If you were really my brother, you'd know I'm only trying to get my life on track, and I need Riley in it for that, Dot. This email wasn't an apology either. It was a half-baked excuse wrapped in self-pity. He's still making himself out to be the victim, ignoring the fact that he cheated on Riley and thought proposing to her at my wedding would somehow solve his problems. He's somehow twisted this entire situation in his head to be about how hard it's been for him. He's oblivious to the hurt he's caused both Riley and me, and he's blaming everyone but himself. The real kicker came a few hours later when my mum sent me a message saying she'd heard I'd refused to help Nick and that I was letting the family down. It was a typical guilt trip, full of lines like, "We expected better from you," and "You're breaking your father's heart." She even threw in a reminder of all they'd sacrificed for me over the years, which was particularly ironic considering Nick has always been the favourite. It was like she was twisting the knife just to see if she could get me to change my mind. I realised at that moment that nothing I said or did would change their perspective. They were committed to their version of events, and in their eyes, Nick could do no wrong. I decided to call it a night, figuring the best course was to ignore them and let things settle down. But of course, that wasn't going to happen either. The next morning, Amy came to me looking worried. My parents had contacted her, asking her to talk sense into me. They figured if I wouldn't listen to them, maybe Amy could somehow convince me. I felt terrible that they dragged her into this mess, and I was furious that they'd think it was okay to go behind my back like that. Amy told them politely but firmly that this was my decision and that they needed to respect it. I appreciated her support more than I can put into words, but it's just another example of how far my parents will go to manipulate and control the narrative. They want me to fall in line, but I can't. Especially not when they're so blind to Nick's behaviour. Meanwhile, Riley reached out to thank me for having her back. She'd heard through mutual friends about the pressure my parents were putting on me and wanted to make sure I was okay. Talking to her reminded me of why I'd felt compelled to support her in the first place. She didn't deserve the way Nick treated her, and it was clear to me that standing up for her was the right thing to do. In fact, she told me that my message to her had helped her move on from the whole mess, and that knowing someone in Nick's family understood her side made her feel less alone. I didn't tell her about the latest messages from my parents or Nick. I didn't want her feeling guilty for any of this. She deserves to focus on moving forward, not being dragged back into Nick's drama. Later that day, Amy and I had a long talk about where to go from here. She suggested I block my parents and Nick on all fronts, at least temporarily, so we could enjoy some peace. The idea felt drastic, but given their refusal to respect any boundaries, it seemed like the only option left. So I did it. I blocked their numbers, emails, and social media accounts. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief, like I'd finally taken back control of the situation. I don't know how long this peace will last. Knowing my family, they'll find some way to get back in touch eventually. But for now, Amy and I are planning a quiet weekend getaway, a chance to unwind and finally celebrate our marriage without any family drama hanging over us. I can't predict how things will play out, but I do know one thing. I'm done being manipulated. I've made my stance clear, and if my family can't respect that, then I'm better off keeping my distance. It's been a hard lesson to learn, but I'm realizing that sometimes you have to let go of people, even family, who refuse to see you for who you are. They see me as someone who owes them loyalty, even at the cost of my own happiness, but that's not the kind of loyalty I believe in. Supporting Nick blindly isn't loyalty, it's enabling, and I won't be part of that anymore. After blocking my family, things went quiet for a couple of days. Amy and I finally felt some relief. We went on that weekend getaway, taking the time to be together without the usual stressors. For the first time since the wedding, we could actually focus on each other, on our new life as a married couple, instead of on the family chaos. But as expected, that peace didn't last long. A few days after we got back, Amy and I were sitting at home when we heard a loud knock on the door. Sure enough, standing on my porch were my parents, both looking tense and determined. They hadn't called, hadn't warned us they were coming. They just showed up like they were entitled to barge into our lives whenever they felt like it. I opened the door just enough to speak to them but didn't invite them in. I asked what they wanted, keeping my tone as calm as I could. My dad, in his usual stern manner, launched into this speech about how I was acting immature by cutting them off and how it was my duty to help bring the family back together. They went on about how, as the older son, I had an obligation to keep the family strong. I took a deep breath and told them as politely as possible that I wasn't interested in discussing this. I told them they were crossing boundaries and that I'd made my feelings clear. They needed to respect that. But my mum just shook her head, looking at me with this disappointed, almost wounded expression. She started in on how much it hurt her that I was choosing a friend over my brother, completely ignoring the fact that Nick had caused all of this in the first place. That's when I finally snapped. I told them that this wasn't about choosing sides. It was about accountability. I told them that, despite their constant excuses for Nick, he needed to face the consequences of his own actions. I couldn't enable him by pretending what he did was okay. My mum gasped, like I'd said something shocking. And then my dad stepped in, practically shouting that family means supporting each other no matter what. He even threw in that if I'd ever made mistakes, they'd still be there for me. So why wasn't I there for Nick? At that moment, I felt like I was talking to strangers. Here they were, so blinded by their own idea of family loyalty that they couldn't see the harm in covering for Nick's terrible behaviour. I told them, as calmly as I could, that enabling someone who refuses to take responsibility isn't love, and that if they genuinely wanted what was best for Nick, they'd make him see how he hurt people, starting with Riley. But of course, they didn't want to hear that. My dad muttered that I was brainwashed by Riley and that I'd never been a true brother to Nick. That was the final straw. I told them I was done and that they could either respect my boundaries or not contact me again. With that, I closed the door. Amy hugged me, saying she was proud of me, but I still felt that sting, the kind you get when you know that no matter how many times you explain yourself, some people just won't listen. In the following days, I expected them to try calling again, but they didn't. Things went quiet. And then, about a week later, I got a text from one of my cousins, Emily, saying she'd seen a long post from my parents on Facebook. Curious, but dreading what they'd said, I opened my phone, and there it was, a public post from my parents, explaining to everyone how devastated they were over the rift in the family. They went on to say that I had been misled by a friend who didn't have the family's best interests at heart. The post didn't mention Riley by name, but it didn't need to. Everyone knew who they meant. What got me most was that they included my name at the bottom, as if I'd co-signed their statement. In the post, they wrote, "We, as a family, hope that one day Jake will see the light and return to us with a renewed sense of family loyalty." It felt surreal, seeing my name attached to their narrative as if I'd somehow betrayed them by standing up for Riley and calling Nick out. That was it. I took screenshots of the post and messaged them, demanding they take my name off and delete the entire thing. Of course, they didn't respond, so I called a few family members to set the record straight. I made it clear that I had no part in that post and that my parents were making it up to guilt-trip me into coming back to their version of family unity. I could see from my cousins' and aunts' reactions that most people understood where I was coming from, though a few still thought I was taking things too far. Either way, I'd done what I could. Riley reached out later to say she'd heard about the post and apologised, even though it wasn't her fault. We both laughed it off, but it hurt to know my parents were trying to paint her as the villain just to salvage their precious reputation. Meanwhile, Nick stayed silent. Not a text, not an email, nothing. I thought maybe he was finally giving up. But then, a few days after that post went up, he reached out to me with yet another email. This time, it was different. Not his usual self-pitying rant, but a surprisingly straightforward apology. He said he was sorry for everything that went down at the wedding, though he still couldn't admit he was wrong for proposing. Instead, he phrased it like, "I didn't realise how it would come off, Dot." Then he added that he was hurt by my message to Riley, that it felt like I was supporting her over him when blood should come first. But he also admitted that maybe he'd let his insecurities get the best of him, and he was willing to move forward if I was. The email ended with him saying he wanted us to be real brothers again, and that he missed having me around. I'll be honest, it was confusing. Part of me wanted to accept it, to believe he was genuinely sorry. But the other part of me couldn't ignore all the ways he'd hurt people, especially Riley, just to satisfy his own ego. I shared the email with Amy and we talked it through. She pointed out that it didn't feel like a real apology, more like he was checking boxes so I'd come back into the family fold. I knew she was right, but it still left me with this sinking feeling. After all, he is my brother. I decided not to respond. For the first time, I felt at peace with that decision. I wasn't interested in patching things up just because he felt guilty or because my parents were pushing him. If he genuinely wanted to make things right, he'd have to start by taking real responsibility for his actions, both to Riley and to me. Anything less wasn't going to cut it. It's strange, but standing up to my family like this has shown me that loyalty isn't about blind obedience. Loyalty is being able to look out for the people you care about, even if it means going against the people you've known all your life. I know this isn't what my family wants to hear, but it's what I need to move forward. I can't keep being their version of a good son or loyal brother if it means sacrificing my own values. So for now, I'm focusing on Amy and building our life together. I'm giving my family the space they need to figure things out on their own. Whether or not Nick learns from this is up to him, and as much as it hurts, I'm okay with letting that be his journey to take. It's been a few months since the dust settled. I kept to my word, focusing on my own life with Amy and cutting off contact with my family. For the most part, it's been peaceful. No sudden pop-ins from my parents, no guilt-tripping emails from Nick. It's amazing what a little distance can do, not just for peace of mind, but for perspective. In that time, I've realized something important. As much as family bonds mean, sometimes holding on to toxic connections can do more harm than good. About a month ago, though, I did get some news from a cousin, Emily. She'd heard through the family grapevine that Nick was going through a rough patch. According to her, his job had cut his hours, and his relationship with my parents was strained because, apparently, my mum and dad were getting tired of his attitude. Emily didn't have all the details, but it sounded like things had started to backfire for him. I wasn't surprised. It was only a matter of time. Nick's pattern of running from consequences had finally caught up to him, and with my parents coddling him less, he didn't have a fallback. Emily mentioned that my parents were starting to regret how they'd handled things with me, too. She said that, as family events rolled around, people noticed my absence. They'd all started asking questions, which of course led to some uncomfortable truths coming out about my wedding and the fallout with Nick. My parents hadn't expected people to be so interested in my side of things, but as it turns out, they weren't as convincing in their victim narrative as they'd hoped. I guess people could see through it, and honestly, I don't blame them. Family can sense when things aren't adding up. A week after that, I got an unexpected call from my dad. It had been so long since I'd heard from him that I almost didn't recognize the number. His voice sounded rough, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure what he was doing. He asked how I was doing and if things were going well with Amy. There was this odd silence before he finally brought up the real reason he was calling. "Your mum and I, we've been talking, Jake. We might have been a little hard on you. It wasn't our intention to push you away. I didn't know what to say. This was probably the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him." He went on to explain that they'd been reflecting on how they handled things with Nick, especially at my wedding. He didn't go into specifics, but he admitted that they might have been a bit blind in their loyalty to him. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. And coming from my dad, I knew that was about as close as it would ever get. I told him I appreciated the call, and that I'd always be willing to have a relationship with them if it was built on mutual respect. I said that I was done with the favoritism, with being put in a position where I had to choose between my own boundaries and their idea of family unity. If they wanted a real connection with me, it would have to be on those terms. My dad seemed taken aback, but he didn't argue. Instead, he just said he'd think about it and that he'd tell my mum. We ended the call on a somewhat neutral note, and while I didn't expect any big changes overnight, I felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they were finally beginning to understand that they couldn't guilt or manipulate me back into the family. Maybe they were finally starting to see me for who I really was. As for Nick, I haven't heard a word. I don't expect to. Last I heard, he's still in the same cycle, running from one thing to the next without really facing his own issues. Part of me wants to reach out to see if he's okay, but I know better. I've already done more than enough to extend an olive branch, and all he ever gave me in return was resentment and jealousy. It's up to him now to find his own way, and I've finally come to terms with that. Through all of this, Amy has been my rock. She reminds me that just because someone's family doesn't mean they have the right to pull you down. We've built a life together that's free from that constant weight of expectations, and I've never been happier. We've even started talking about expanding our family, and it feels amazing to think of starting something new. A family dynamic that's centered on love, respect, and openness. I know we'll make mistakes like any family, but we'll face them together without blame or favoritism. Looking back, the journey wasn't easy. Breaking away from the toxic patterns in my family felt like tearing out a part of myself. But as the months go by, I see that I've gained so much more in return. Freedom, self-respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. I've learned that family doesn't have to mean sacrifice at the cost of self-worth. It can be a source of support and strength as long as everyone respects each other's individuality. For now, I'm moving forward, focusing on the people who lift me up instead of pulling me down. If my parents ever want to truly reconcile, I'll be open to it. But if they can't respect who I am, I'm okay with letting go. As for Nick, I hope he finds peace one day. But that's his path to walk, not mine. Thanks for following along on this journey. It's been a long road, but I'm finally at peace with where I stand. Here's to a new chapter, with family as I define it. Story 2. My parents insisted that I send the $37,000 I had accumulated for my business to my golden child brother. You won't understand why. I suppose you could say that there has always been some dysfunction in my family. Not like a really dysfunctional family, but the type where there is clear partiality, and the older child always seems to receive everything while the younger child is left on their own dot. By the way, that's me, the younger one, Matt, my elder brother. The golden child is him. At the age of 24, he has essentially coasted through life thus far. He isn't actually employed, has been unemployed for months, and the few times he has had a job, it has always ended because he left or was fired for some dumb reason. He's that person who manages to get away with doing nothing at all, and yet convinces my parents to give him what he wants. In the meantime, I'm 19 years old, doing part-time jobs, going to school, and somehow I'm supposed to be the one with everything together. It's been a while since I started saving. I've been working wherever I can since I was 15. To save money for the future, I would do anything from delivering food to stacking shelves at the grocery store. I wasn't interested in taking the typical road of working a dull 9 to 5. I've had this company concept for years and have been considering it. I was pleased with myself, but I won't go into all the specifics because they aren't important to the plot. On my own, I was able to accumulate $37,000. No assistance from my parents, no freebies, just me working whenever I could. And I intend to launch this firm with that sum of money. You would think my folks would be pleased with me now, wouldn't they? Like, wow, our child is being responsible and working hard. However, they pretend that the money is just lying there, ready to be used to solve whatever issue Matt is having this week. Matt decided he wanted a new apartment around a month ago. He's been living in this tiny apartment, which is very okay for someone without a job who doesn't make their rent payments on time. Half the time. However, it seems that he no longer found it satisfactory. In one of the best areas of town, he discovered this gorgeous new flat. Naturally, he lacked the funds necessary for the deposit. It's shocking. Now, I wasn't concerned when I first learned about it. It was not as though I anticipated being asked to pay for it. Why would they, after all? Isn't that a mature man? He is capable of figuring things out on his own. My parents, however, sat me down one evening. They never sit me down for anything, unless they're about to hurl some big things at me, so I knew something was wrong. Perhaps they would express their pride in me for all the rescuing I had done, I reasoned. Or perhaps they wanted to discuss the progress of my company concept. It would have been pleasant. However, they caught me off guard. Matt has to be discussed. My mother began staring at me gravely. Only when she's going to guilt trip someone does she withdraw. He's short on the deposit, but he got an apartment. I waited there, waiting for her to say anything else. I mean, how was that related to me? Then she said it. We believe that giving Matt your funds would be wise. Even though it's simply sitting in your account, he truly needs this location. I gave her a blink. Yes, it was incorrect what I had heard. No way, I mean. My finances were seriously threatened. The $37,000 I'd earned over years of labor. At first, I was unable to even reply for Matt and an apartment. I felt as though I had entered another universe where people genuinely believed it to be an acceptable request. Hold on, what was it all about? I was able to escape. My dad tried to seem like the voice of reason when he said, Matt has been going through a rough time, and we just believe that you should support him as a family. You don't really need the money at the moment. My face was becoming hotter. I was still in shock that they were telling me this. Do you want my savings to be given to him? The funds I've been setting up for my company. Indeed, my mother stated as if it were the most apparent thing in the world. Your household, you ought to be prepared to assist. My thoughts were racing as I sat there. They wanted me to part with my funds, but that wasn't all. They were doing it that way, as if I had no other option, as if I was supposed to, and because Matt needs it more, I should just roll over and do it. Then my father revealed the truth. Perhaps you should start searching for a new place to live if you're unwilling to assist your brother. I swear, for a moment my heart stopped. In reality, they were threatening to evict me because of money I had received from Matt's flat. I was stunned. How in the world could they believe that was acceptable? Every nickel of those $37,000 was earned by myself. I was planning. I wasn't only enjoying myself while sitting on it. It was meant to mark the beginning of my future and my escape from reliance on others. My mum started talking again about how family comes first, so they must have seen how quiet I was. Matt would also take care of you. Note, Matt has never helped me in any way. Never. He has never even volunteered to provide a hand around the house, much less with money. However, I'm expected to simply give him my future. To be honest, I was only stalling when I told them I needed some time to think about it. I had no idea what to do, but I also had no intention of giving them that money. I had no other strategy, and they were threatening to throw me out. I didn't yet have enough to support myself. While simultaneously attempting to launch a business. I thus tried to solve the problem over the following few days. My parents continued to behave like I was a criminal for not giving them my funds right away. My dad began saying things like, "It must be nice to have money and not worry about your family," in a passive-aggressive manner, while Matt and I were ignored by my mother. I heard nothing from him. As long as he had his flat, he probably didn't care. After that night, things continued to deteriorate. I was just beginning to digest everything. Give us your $37,000 so we can buy Matt's flat. And suddenly I was under continual strain. Living there felt like being in a pressure cooker that may explode at any moment. My folks would somehow bring it up every single day. At random, my mom would bring up the subject of Matt's stress and need for help, and she would advise me to consider taking on the role of family caregiver. For example, how many different methods are there to guilt trip someone in a single conversation? It seems like my mother was determined to find out. However, my father chose a different path. He wasn't as straightforward as my mother. Instead, if we were in the same room, he would make these remarks. Things like, "You're fortunate that you don't yet have any real responsibilities." Or, "We are resilient because of the sacrifices made by our families." Yes, all right, father. Very subtle. Why they believed this would work is beyond me. If anything, it deepened my investigation. However, it was becoming more difficult to handle. I felt like I was being ambushed every time I entered the kitchen. They would be waiting for me to say something like, after listening to their guilt trips for the 100th time, I'd magically change my mind. However, Matt himself was the true kicker. What irritated me the most was that he spoke very little. He seemed indifferent to the source of the funds. He would sit in the living room watching TV or browsing on his phone as long as he had his apartment, totally unaware that I was being inundated with this bullshit. There were moments when I wanted to scream at him, "Dude, why don't you try working for something or getting a job for once?" However, I didn't. I have no idea why. Perhaps I was hoping that they would all realize their mistake. For the record, they didn't. This continued for a few days before I realized I needed some time alone. I could at least attempt to escape the continual pressure for a little while, but I didn't have the money to move out because I was saving for my business, not rent. I so began to use the library as an escape by remaining late at school. It was preferable than staying at home and putting up with my parents' constant attempts to drain my funds. However, even that was short-lived. I thought I had escaped the daily guilt-tripping session until I arrived home late one afternoon. However, my mother was waiting for me in the kitchen as soon as I entered. She seemed to have spent the whole day getting ready for this discussion. She wasted no time at all. Standing there with her arms crossed as if I were some disobedient child breaking curfew, she continued, "We need to talk." "What is it about?" I asked, hoping she might at least surprise me with something different for once, even though I knew precisely what was going to happen. "You are aware of the purpose of this. Her voice was tight with fury as she spoke. "Matt's flat. That money is necessary for him. We can't wait forever, even if we've been patient with you." I could sense my face getting hotter. I really tried not to lose it, but it was difficult. "I've said it 1,000,000 times, Mum. I keep that money for my company. I will not just divulge it. She let out a sigh, pretending that she was the one who had to deal with irrational individuals. "You're being self-centered. You are aware of that. You have the resources to assist Matt, who is having difficulties. We would expect him to assist you if you were in his position." The sentence that triggered me was that one. It was absurd to think that Matt would ever assist me if the roles were reversed. "You know that Matt wouldn't do anything for me." I spoke, attempting to maintain a steady tone. "I haven't even been asked for the money by him. All he's doing is sitting there waiting for you to present him with it." My mother's expression tightened as if she didn't want to acknowledge my correctness, but she knew it in her heart. "He is your sibling." Her voice became softer as she spoke. "Family members support one another." I gave a headshake. Family members support one another. However, it is reciprocal. Every time he makes a mistake, I'm not here to save him. For that money, I've put in too much labor. My dad entered the discourse at that time, entering the kitchen with a look on his face as though he were going to make a big announcement that would end all problems. He crossed his arms and added, "Your mum's right. Money isn't the only factor here. It has to do with family. You're too young to really comprehend yet. One day, though, you'll realize that sometimes you have to give up something for the people you care about." What I was hearing was unbelievable. They were treating me like a cold-blooded monster because I didn't want to waste years of labor so my brother might live in a better home. "How about me?" I fired back. "Does my future really matter? I'm not only hoarding this cash for amusement, there's a reason I preserved it. For my company." With a shrug as if it were no great issue, my dad added, "You can always save more money later. However, Matt needs this flat immediately." Talking to a brick wall was like that. They kept returning to the same subject regardless of what I replied. I should just give the money to Matt. He needs it. It made no difference how hard I'd tried to rescue it or what I had planned for it. They didn't care about any of that. The worst thing was that they didn't even appear to be concerned about Matt's accountability for this. They weren't pressuring him to get a job or learn how to get by on his own. Not at all. As in my whole life, it was entirely my responsibility to solve his difficulties. I was always the one who had to make up for Matt's mistakes. I had a gut feeling that they wouldn't alter their views no matter how much I argued. Probably even before they set me down that first night. They had already made up their minds. Until I departed or gave them what they wanted, the pressure would not end. And to be honest, it was beginning to seem like my only choice at that point was to leave. However, it wasn't that easy. I had no contingency plan. I had insufficient funds to maintain my savings and pay my rent. Not like my pals had extra rooms laying around. I felt confined. I was going to lose something, whatever I choose. I had to choose between giving them the money and jeopardizing my future, or refusing to back down and running the possibility of being evicted with nowhere to go. The worst aspect, too, my folks seemed unconcerned. They had no regard for my future or what was right. They were just concerned with seeing to Matt's needs. I didn't care how much that cost. I wasn't prepared to quit up just yet, even though things were looking somewhat dismal. I had reached my breaking point after a week of my parents' relentless prodding. The guilt-tripping, the passive-aggressive remarks, and the sense that I was always the evil person were too much for me to handle. They seemed to dig their heels in deeper the more I attempted to reason with them. However, what they were saying wasn't even the worst part. The reason for this was that they genuinely thought Matt should have my money, as if it were his birthright or something, and that he was entitled to it just because he needed an apartment. I was worn out. In order to avoid returning home and having to cope with the disaster that awaited me, I either worked part-time or hid out at school throughout the day. But I couldn't really vanish, no matter how hard I tried to stay away from them. At some point, they were always able to corner me, and the topic of talk kept coming up. How I had to take Matt's place. I thus made the decision to stop one evening. I refused to be pushed about any longer. I refused to give my funds to Matt, and I'd be happy to go if that meant it. Instead of giving up all I've fought so hard to achieve, I'd rather be homeless. I couldn't continue living this way, even though I knew it wouldn't be easy. I needed to make a decision. My parents were waiting for me in the living room when I arrived home that evening. Their expressions suggested that they had spent the whole day preparing for this discussion. Even before I sat down, I could sense the tension in the room. "Are you still undecided?" Without even trying to strike up a conversation, my dad inquired. I understood his true question. It was merely a polite way of stating decision. "Have you yet to give in?" "Yes, I have decided what I want to do," I said, attempting to seem calm. I refused to give my funds to Matt. The ensuing quiet seemed heavy, as if the room's air had been drawn out. My mum looked like she was going to cry, and my dad's jaw was clenched as he gazed at me. "Are you serious?" At last, in a trembling voice, my mother spoke. "This is how you pay us back for everything we've done for you. Once more, here we go. The Olympics of guilt-tripping, Mama. Money is for my business, as I have stated 1,000 times. For years, I have been preserving it. Matt doesn't feel like working, so I won't just give it to him. My father narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. "Matt's lack of employment isn't the issue. It has to do with family, and your brother is in need of assistance right now. You have everything from us, and this is the only thing we're requesting. Just one thing." It nearly made me chuckle. "Are you requesting that I part with all of my savings? This favor is not insignificant. Are you requesting that I forfeit my future in order for Matt to obtain an apartment? He hasn't had any employment. Matt's been going through a difficult period." As she wiped her eyes, my mother spoke. "This is what he needs. You can't imagine what it's like to go through what he has." What I was hearing was unbelievable. "Are you serious, Mum? Since I was 15, I had been working really hard, save every penny for this enterprise. You quote, re-behaving as though I haven't been having difficulties. We have been of great assistance to you," my father interrupted. "We provided you with a place to live. We helped you during your time in school. Backed me up?" I lost my temper. "I've been covering all of the costs myself. You folks are aware that I haven't received a single penny for education." I could sense my chest getting angrier. Normally, I wouldn't get fired up or shout, but I was simply fed up with this. They always changed it to something else when I tried to explain myself, as if I were the one acting irrationally. I got up and said, "Look, I'm not doing this. It's okay if you want to expel me for refusing to surrender Matt my funds. I quote, going out. However, I will not give him any money." My mother gasped as if I had just declared that I was shunning the family or something. "Would you truly abandon your family for financial gain?" "I'm being kicked out by you, Mum," I fired back. "It's you, not me, who are making this all about the money." I briefly believed that they may finally understand. Perhaps they would see how twisted up this whole thing was and pull away. However, no. With his arms crossed as if to convey his seriousness to me, my dad got to his feet. "You're not welcome in this house if you're not willing to help your brother," he stated. The ultimatum was there. I was both happy that the suspense was finally over and furious that they would actually follow through on this. I was aware of my exact position now. "All right," my voice was flat as I spoke. "By the end of the week, I'll be gone." My dad just stood there as if he had achieved some sort of moral victory, while my mum started crying. Naturally, Matt wasn't even at home while this was happening, most likely hanging out with buddies or doing whatever he did for a living. I headed up to my room after turning. My mind is racing. Even though I knew I was doing morally, it was nonetheless unsettling. Even though I had no clear plan and had no idea where I was heading, I wasn't going to allow them to intimidate me into parting with my funds. My future depended on that money, and I wasn't going to let them take it away from me because Matt wasn't motivated to improve his life. The days that followed were stressful. My parents hardly ever talked to me, and when they did, it was only to make me feel worse. As if I had broken her heart, my mom would sit at the kitchen table and wipe her eyes and sniffle. My father used to mumble to himself about how unappreciative I was and how I was destroying the family. But I didn't back down. I began packing in silence, gradually transferring my belongings to a friend's house. I knew I needed to be prepared for when it was time to depart, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I still harbored the hope that they may finally realize their mistake. Perhaps they would see the unfairness of their request. However, it became increasingly evident that they would not budge with each day that went by. There was no reversing their decision to pick Matt over me. My departure was scheduled for the previous evening. My mother made one more attempt to coerce me into remaining. She approached my room. She perched on the side of my bed, her eyes streaming with tears. She whispered, "Please don't do this. You're not required to go. We can figure something out." I gave a headshake. "I'm not handing my savings to Matt, Mum. I'm just going to stay that way, right?" It was a long time before she spoke. Simply sat there and gazed at the ground. At last, she stood up and left without saying anything more. That was the end of it. I packed up what I had left and headed off the following day. I felt as though I was leaving the house and entering another reality. My duffel bag was in my hand, my backpack was thrown over one shoulder, and my heart was racing. As I left, my mother remained silent. My dad wasn't there, and she was in the kitchen just gazing at the table. That must have been their way of letting me know they didn't give a damn if I remained or went. When I first stepped outdoors, I experienced a strange sensation of liberation together with a strong sense of what in the world am I going to do? I hadn't given leaving the house any thought. Although it was just temporary, I had some of my belongings stored at a friend's house and intended to stay there for a time. I was being smacked hard by the truth of it all. In a sense, I was homeless. I arrived later that day at my friend's house. Fortunately, he was okay with me spending some time on his sofa because he was one of the few people I had told about what was happening. I told him everything that had happened from the time my parents requested my money until the last blow, when they essentially fired me. When we sat down that evening, he shook his head and remarked, "Dude, that's messed up. Why they would expect you to turn over everything in that manner is beyond me." I gave a shrug. I'm still attempting to understand it myself. Man, it's always been that way with Matt. He makes a mistake and I end up having to correct it somehow. They simply went to a whole new level this time. For hours on end, we spoke about how I was going to manage things from here. I didn't want to remain too long, but he said I could stay as long as I needed to. Although I was grateful for the gesture, I realized I couldn't stay on his sofa indefinitely. Trying to figure out what to do next took up the next few days. When I contacted the housing office at my school to inquire about emergency accommodations, they informed me that none were available. However, it was better than nothing when they provided me with some leads on local resources. I began searching for affordable flats close to university, but the majority were much above my means. Even though I still had money saved up, I was already feeling uneasy about taking money out of my company fund to pay the rent. In the meantime, my parents' radio silences all calls and texts. I seemed to have vanished from the world. There was a glimmer of hope that they may see how bad things were and get in touch. but nothing happened. To be honest, I wasn't surprised that Matt didn't say anything either. I think he was upset because I didn't give him my money so he could move into his new luxurious home. Normal. After approximately a week of being at my friend's house, things really began to get to me. It went beyond simply not knowing where I would reside. However, that undoubtedly played a significant role. It was the seclusion. Since I was no longer a part of my parents' image, I felt as though I was in limbo, trying to figure out what my life looked like. I was browsing through my phone one evening, trying to decide whether or not to call my folks. I have no idea why. Even though I knew it would never be possible, I suppose there was still a part of me that wanted to make things better. But before I could think about it too much, Matt sent me a message. It was succinct and direct. "I hope you're content. Everything is damaged by you." I felt a mixture of incredulity and rage as I gazed at the television. Ruined everything. How did I feel about this? It was he who was attempting to steal my money, and it was me that was expelled for advocating for myself. But I was the bad guy in Matt's perspective. I didn't even try to respond. There was no purpose. I was done battling with them since everything I said would only lead to another argument. I threw my phone onto the couch and tried to concentrate on determining my next course of action. I made the decision to see a lawyer the next day. I've been delaying it because I didn't want things to get out of hand. But I wasn't taking any chances after Matt sent me that note. In addition to making sure my money was safeguarded, I wanted to find out whether there was anything further I could do to legally protect myself in the event that circumstances worsened. I met a lawyer who was remarkably laid back. Without interjecting, he listened to my narrative before offering me some wise counsel. The good news was that my parents couldn't legally take money out of my savings without my permission. The bad news was that, if they were desperate enough, they may still look for a way out. He suggested that, just in case, I start creating a paper trail of all my communications with my family and safeguard all of my financial records. After that encounter, I felt a bit more certain I was at least somewhat protected by the law. In the event that my parents attempted any nefarious actions, I now had a strategy. The entire thing felt heavier than before, though. I had to cope with more than simply a family dispute. I was coping with the fear that my own parents might attempt to defraud me in court. To put it mildly, it was gloomy. I spent the following few weeks concentrating on turning my life around. I started saving every cent I could after finding a part-time job that paid more than my previous one. Unless it was absolutely necessary, I was resolved not to touch my company capital. I also persisted in my search for an apartment until I was fortunate. A bit further from college, I discovered this small studio flat, but it was affordable and perfectly within my means. At the end of the month, I moved in. Not much. It was my room, a single room with a little kitchen and a bathroom that was more like a closet. And after all that had transpired, I felt somewhat in control of my life once more for the first time in weeks. However, there was nothing at all going on with my family. Since Matt's communication, they hadn't made another attempt to get in touch with me. No attempts to make amends or provide an apology. They seemed to have forgotten about me. That hurt a part of me. But I also felt a sense of relief. Their drama was no longer something I had to cope with. Without having to worry about being caught up in Matt's turmoil all the time, I could concentrate on my own life and my own objectives. However, there were still times when everything felt too much, despite that freedom. If I claimed it didn't affect me occasionally, I would be lying on certain evenings. I would lie in bed and gaze at the ceiling, questioning whether I had made the correct decision. I was wondering if there was anything I could have done better. However, each time I considered caving in, I reminded myself of the original reason I had left. This represented my future, my money, and my life, and nobody was going to take it away from me, not even my family. I felt a strange mixture of relief and loneliness as I settled into my new flat. I had a place of my own at last. On the one hand, I wanted to go somewhere where I wouldn't have to deal with Matt's arrogant attitude or guilt-tripping parents. I was alone, my mind and the tiny area I could truly call my own. On the other side, I had the strange feeling that I was free. However, it wasn't the level of independence I had anticipated at 19. The flat was so small that it could hardly fit a desk, a bed, and a small refrigerator. But I wasn't very bothered by it. My money was still locked up, and I had previously managed to make it work with far less, unharmed and safe. That was what mattered most. Even though I knew I still had a long way to go, at least I was in charge now, rather than them. Adjustment was the main focus of the first several weeks. I immersed myself into my studies and job, keeping my head down and concentrating on my tasks. In order to ensure that I had enough money to pay for rent and other necessities without using my business savings, I even took on a few additional shifts at my new work. Although it wasn't simple, it was satisfying to know that every dollar I earned supported a cause close to my heart. I had not given up on my entrepreneurial idea, not by a long stretch. But despite my best efforts to concentrate on the future, the past kept resurfacing. There was a persistent nagging sensation in the back of my mind. What if my folks got in touch? What if they expressed regret? What if Matt genuinely matured and came to terms with his past as a jerk? That closure was what I desired. I knew it was unlikely, but nevertheless. I received a random SMS from an unidentified number one evening. I assumed it was spam at first, but then I recognized my dad. Most likely he changed his phone number so that I wouldn't ignore him. However, the message was unambiguous. We must speak. We need to get over this. I debated whether or not to reply for what seemed like hours as I gazed at the letter. They had not communicated with me for weeks, and now they suddenly wanted to put everything behind them. In that very moment, I wasn't comfortable with it. I wasn't prepared to act as though nothing was wrong, especially since they hadn't expressed any regret for what they had done to me. So I didn't respond. They thought they were ready to chat, but I wasn't going to be pulled back into their mess. I wasn't going to expend any more energy on them if they couldn't respect me or my limits. I received another text message a few days later from Matt this time. He had a much shorter message. This has to be fixed. What precisely should be fixed? Nothing on my end needed to be fixed. Since I'd gone, he hadn't gotten in touch. Don't apologize. There was no recognition of their unfairness. Most likely all he intended to do was make me feel awful by guilting me. But that game was over for me. I also didn't respond to him. I came to a realization at that point. I had had enough of waiting for them. There was nothing that I owed them. Not forgiveness, not a discussion, and most definitely not my savings. I genuinely felt in charge of my life for the first time in a long time. It wasn't flawless, and occasionally I still thought I may have done things differently. Overall, though, I knew I had made the proper choice. They may make as many attempts as they wanted, but only if they were prepared to accept genuine responsibility for the events that transpired. I had no interest. Life went on. Whenever I had time, I put myself into my business plans. In an effort to have a better understanding of how I might really make this work, I began doing additional research and connecting with others online. It was progress, although a gradual one. At least my family and I were no longer caught in that destructive loop. Felt as though I was always one step away from manipulation or betrayal. However, I was thrown with another curve right when I felt like I was really making progress. I received a call from an old family friend a few weeks after my dad and Matt texted me. It felt strange to see their name appear on my phone as we hadn't spoken in a long time. They seemed reluctant when I replied, as if they were not really interested in telling me what they had phoned about. You should be aware that your parents have been discussing the reasons behind your departure with others. It's not good. A pit started to grow in my stomach. What are you saying? Anticipating whatever perverted version of the tale my parents were circulating, I questioned. They claim that you left the family behind. They went on to say that you departed because you no longer wanted to be a part of the family and that you refused to support Matt when he was having difficulties. They're giving the impression that you abruptly left them without explanation. Naturally. Traditional. That was unacceptable to them. They had to paint me as the bad guy since their absurd demands had drove me away. It infuriated me. However, it wasn't very shocking either. In order to portray themselves as the victims, my parents had always been skilled at manipulating the story. Trying not to let it bother me too much, I thanked the family friend for the heads up and hung up. If they wanted to propagate false information about me, I could provide the receipts to prove that I was telling the truth. I wasn't going to let it ruin the progress I'd made since leaving, but that was their fault. I then permanently blacklisted their phones. The drama was no longer necessary in my life. I learned a lot about boundaries and how crucial it was to defend myself from others who didn't respect them from the whole scenario with my parents. I refused to return to that state of helplessness, no matter how hard they attempted to manipulate events or guilt-trip me. To be honest, since I cut them off, things have been improving. I was able to balance my business ambitions with my employment by finding my rhythm with education and work. I even began spending more time with friends and allowing myself to enjoy life without worrying about my home life all the time. It wasn't flawless. Though I was coming to realize that I couldn't alter my family or attempt to convince them to see my point of view, there were still times when I felt the pull of wanting things to be different and wishing they weren't so dysfunctional. I had to give up hoping that they would suddenly change their minds and say they were sorry. Now I was constructing something for myself, something I owned. My life, my business, and my future, even if it wasn't always simple. Knowing that I was doing it as I wanted to felt really satisfying. I wasn't looking back then. I was tired of being the man who sacrificed everything to maintain harmony, no matter how much they tried to guilt me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly in charge of my own life, and I was making progress. Story 3. My dad refuses to cover my tuition, claims that I would compete for his golden child. However, years later I'm doing well, and he wants this. I am currently 32 years old, and my younger brother is 27. Since my father wasn't around much when I was a child, our mother reared us mostly. In retrospect, it appears like he prioritized his career over his family because he was constantly away on essential tasks. He may have been home occasionally on the weekends, but I don't recall any father-son bonding activities or anything like that. You know, he missed all the little things, school prizes, my first baseball game, even after I broke my arm and ended up in the air. Mum took care of everything. Things had altered by the time my brother arrived. Dad seemed to have flicked a switch. All of a sudden, he was this really involved and hands-on father. Always there at my brother's sporting activities, school functions, and even the odd occasions like Cub Scout meetings. Suddenly, the man who hardly had time to come see me was my brother's ideal father. He would do all the things I wanted he had done with me, like giving pep talks, throwing the football about in the backyard, and engaging in the entire big game talk thing. I no longer have resentment against my brother. He didn't request to be given preferential treatment. I will not lie, though. My brain was somewhat twisted up from watching it all unfold. I was right here. Without even trying, this child who had always wanted a little love from my brother and dad ended up getting it everything. Dad would act as though we were strangers half the time, but when he was with my brother, he would light up as if he were a little version of himself. And I wasn't the only one who noticed. Even Mum could tell. She made an effort to maintain equilibrium. I haven't played favourites or anything. If anything, she worked more with me since she noticed that my dad was more interested in my brother. We would read, play in the kitchen, solve puzzles, and do other quiet activities that were meaningful to me but weren't particularly showy. You don't have to be like your dad to be great, she would often encourage me, and that sustained me, particularly when it seemed like my father was simply disappointed in me for not being into boy stuff. I wanted to hear it. In any case, I stopped attempting to please my father as I grew older. I made many attempts to connect with him in the hopes that he may be interested in anything I found appealing, but to no avail. He would constantly gaze at me as though I were a riddle that he was unable to solve. I simply stopped putting myself out there after a while. Figured he'd have to try to connect if he wanted one. He never did, spoiler alert. However, my brother is quite the reverse. He was all the father desired in a son. Loved athletics. Didn't mind getting his hands filthy. Even possessed the same obstinate mindset. The fact that my brother reminded my dad so much of himself must have pleased him. No matter what they accomplished, they would work together for hours on end. camping and fishing, having a game of catch. I would be reading or fiddling with my computer in my room in the meanwhile, and so they were playing football outside. I was inside working on whatever thing I was working on or reading my books. When Dad came in and saw me immersed in a book or pounding on the keyboard, he would just shake his head. Why couldn't I have another son like my youngest? I could almost hear him asking himself. He didn't have to say it out, but he never did. Every glance had it. Every time Dad sighed and told my brother that he was proud of him, he hardly gave me a glance. In all honesty, I believe that he considered my brother to be his child and me to be his mother's. Perhaps it's because my mother took care of everything for me. You name it. Schoolwork, school functions, plane trips, etc. When he was present, Dad would just go about his own business, occasionally offering some wise counsel. Since he didn't know me, that didn't really mean anything. He didn't even make an effort to comprehend me half the time. What about the other half? He didn't notice since he was too preoccupied with my brother. When my brother reached the age where he joined every sports team, I was there. Coaching him became Dad's second job. They would be really excited when they arrived home after games, telling me about my brother's incredible play or how he won player of the match. Dad would continue talking as if I weren't even there, and I would sit there and listen nicely while nodding along. For simply sitting there, I didn't anticipate a huge pat on the back. However, it would have been pleasant if he had inquired about my activities. To be honest, I had always thought that as I grew older, things would change, and perhaps my father would see that I wasn't useless, because I wasn't like him. However, no. A real man isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, he would add. Alternatively, why don't you join a team? I recall experiencing a mixture of disappointment and irritation, as if I would never be sufficient for him just as I was. Mum, on the other hand, was the opposite. I would answer her questions on the novels I was reading, sit with me and pay attention while I worked on various IT projects. I only needed to hear her say that she was proud of me. She never once made me feel like I needed to alter or become more manly in order to be valuable if it weren't for her. And in retrospect, she was most likely attempting to be both parents because she knew my dad wouldn't be able to step up. Later on, I doubt I would have had the courage to pursue my aspirations at all. Here's the problem, though. Everything came apart when I lost her. At the age of 13, the one person who truly understood me vanished out of thin air. Dad seemed to become much more involved in my brother's life after she went away. They got closer, and I simply disappeared into the background, if that was even possible. It felt more and more like I was just a reminder of everything he didn't like about me, despite my best efforts to keep trying and find a way to connect with him. Growing up wasn't always easy, particularly when I had to observe my brother and father share a close friendship that I was never able to experience. I am aware that some may argue that this is the nature of families. Favorites exist among parents. However, you won't understand what it's like to feel like the second best member of your own family until you're that outsider looking in. Being accepted by him was all I ever desired, but it never came to pass. Today, when we were kids, my brother was too small to see any of this, and I doubt he really understands how things turned out today. Even though I don't blame him and it wasn't his fault, I can't help but remember it. Everything changed after Mum passed away. I had lost the only person who truly understood me, and I was only 13 years old. My entire world seemed to become dark. I felt lost without her, as if nobody was left in the home who could even see or comprehend me. My sole source of support had been her. The one person who saw promise in me is now gone. Things in the house were much more intense when she passed away. One would expect that everyone would come together after losing a parent, as if we'd all begin to depend on one another to get by. However, that did not occur, not even close. My brother and father continued to act as though nothing had happened. As if we hadn't recently lost the family's affection. As I tried to come to terms with this enormous loss, I was crushed, as they pretended that nothing was out of the ordinary. My dad seemed to put even more emphasis on his connection with my brother, leaving me behind, if anything. One day, perhaps a few months after Mum's death, I recall returning home from school. My day had been difficult. Children expressing sympathy as if it were the first time they had ever heard instructors look at me with such pity. I just wanted to feel like I wasn't alone when I got home. However, my dad and my brother were watching TV together and joking about something, seemingly carefree when I stepped in my own home. I felt like a ghost. I began to stay in my room a lot more. To be honest, being near them hurt too much. They would walk in while I was in the kitchen preparing a snack for myself, discussing my brother's most recent football game or another activity they had done together. They would hardly give me a glance. They seemed to be completely unaware that I was standing there. Dad would give me this look like, "Why are you interrupting?" whenever I tried to offer something to the discourse or weigh in. Eventually, I simply quit up. I had no idea to whom I should turn now that my mother was gone. I needed someone to confide in about how difficult things had become. However common nobody was present. My father was too preoccupied with treating my brother like his little henchman. What about my brother? He was only a child after all. He was preoccupied with his own affairs. Most likely, I was unaware of how different things were for me. I therefore threw myself into what I already knew, technical coding, specifically. Initially, it served only as a diversion, a means of diverting my attention. However, the more I immersed myself in it, the more I recognized my strengths. Every time I figured something out, I would spend hours learning new things, working on projects and creating websites from scratch. I would experience a tiny glimmer of fulfillment. It was something to cling to, something independent of other people. And for a while, it was enough. But of course, Dad didn't see it that way. To him, I was just wasting my time on the computer. He'd make these snide comments whenever he saw me coding. Like, when are you going to do something useful or real? Men don't hide behind a screen. I just nod and keep working. I'd learned by then that arguing with him was pointless. If he couldn't understand it, then it wasn't worth his attention. Then there was this one day that really sticks out. I'd been working on this project for weeks, building a small program that could help with basic tasks, something simple but cool, especially for my age. I was excited, it was finally working and I wanted to show someone. My first instinct was to tell my dad. Stupid as that sounds now, I think I still craved his approval, no matter how many times he'd neglected me. So I went over to him, showed him what I'd created, and explained how it worked, hoping he'd realize how much work I'd put in. But he simply glanced at the TV, gave me this half-hearted "that's good," and went straight back to whatever he was doing. That was the moment it hit me. No matter what I did, he was never going to care. He was too busy being my brother's biggest fan to even notice my achievements, let alone encourage them. From that moment on, I stopped searching for his approval totally. I kept my head down, did my own thing, and assumed if he didn't care, then neither did I. I return home, go directly to my room and work on my projects for hours. It was my escape, my means of gaining some control in a world that felt upside down. And every time I'd learn something new or develop something great, it seemed like a tiny win, even if no one else noticed. I started saving money doing little tech tasks here and there for folks who needed help fixing computers, developing simple websites, troubleshooting whatever I could find to generate a little cash. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. Enough to give me the impression that I was genuinely making progress. I didn't require my father's blessing or his approval. I was solving problems on my own. My brother, meantime, was flourishing under Dad's tutelage. He was often getting excited at family get-togethers and was the football team's standout. Get the standard then. Oh, and you continue to use the computer. I decide there's no need in attempting to explain, so I just nod. While I was left to fend for myself, my brother received all of our father's attention and pride. And look, I know it seems trivial, but things like that do important at that age. When the things that define you don't appear to matter to your family, it screws with you. It makes you question whether they could be correct and whether your current course of action is indeed a waste of time. Even if my dad couldn't see it, I knew deep down that I had to show to myself that I was valuable, so I persevered and continued working on my tech projects. I eventually adapted to living alone. That was just more convenient. I had my world while Dad and my brother had theirs. While I was in my room with my laptop coding non-stop, they were all about sports, interacting with others and attending games. It wasn't too horrible, to be honest. My feeling of purpose and my small successes were sufficient. However, I would be lying if I said that I didn't occasionally wonder why I couldn't join them when I saw them laughing carelessly while throwing a football around in the yard outside the window. Why my father didn't want me to be his son. Why did I not fit within that image? But I suppose that's simply the way it was. My journey was mine. As long as I had my technology and my projects, I was learning to live with theirs. I had the impression that I was creating something significant and genuine, even though Dad would never get it. I knew what I wanted to pursue by the time I was graduating from high school: technology. After years of experimentation, my coding skills were finally beginning to pay off. I was prepared to turn it into a job because I had completed a few little tasks and had a tiny web portfolio. For me, it seemed obvious that I should major in computer science in college. I started applying since I couldn't think of any other option. I also didn't aim low. I chose large universities with strong technology departments because I knew they would help me go where I wanted to go. To gain some practical experience, I even arranged a summer internship at a nearby software business. For the first time, I thought I was headed in the right direction, something I owned. This is where things became messy, though. My dad didn't exactly leap at the chance to help me because he hadn't been really interested in my computer adventure. I was aware that college would be costly, particularly for the universities I had applied to. I also needed assistance with tuition, even though I had several scholarships lined up. That's what I did, as anyone in my situation would. I sat him down and explained everything. I explained to him my objectives and how technology was now more than just a pastime. It was my future. He listened, but it was clear to me that he was not really taking anything in. With a sigh, he replied, "Look, I don't think it's worth spending all that money on something so unpredictable." When I finished, the only thing I could do was sit there in shock as he said something about stability and genuine work. This, after all, was coming from the person who could spend money on my brother's athletic supplies without hesitation. My brother received all the funding he required for his training sessions, travel, and games. But all of a sudden, the cost of my schooling and future was too much. I made an effort to clarify that this wasn't a random chance. I was prepared to work hard and had a strategy. I even discussed the internship I had landed and showed him my scholarship letters. However, he simply shook his head, behaving as though I were a naive child pursuing a fantasy. He says, "Your brother needs our help right now because he's having trouble with his grades. This is something you can work out for yourself." I'd rather not say it, but that line really got to me. It seemed to him that all I had fought for and everything I was attempting to create was just invisible. No matter how hard I attempted to talk sense into his head, it was obvious that he was not going to assist. I don't believe the primary problem was the money. He simply did not believe that technology was a legitimate investment. I packed up my belongings, left the house, and headed straight to my aunt's residence after that chat. The one person I felt I could turn to was my aunt, who was my mom's elder sister, and had always been there in the background. She didn't have a lot of money or a gorgeous home, but she paid attention. I told her everything. She immediately offered me a place to stay despite the whole situation with my dad. However, it wasn't simple to move in with her. Her home was in a totally different area of town and was smaller. I had to start again, change schools, and say goodbye to the few friends I had left. However, that was my only option. I couldn't continue to live in a household where I felt alienated from my own relatives. She did something that really caught me off guard when I informed her about my ambitions to attend college. She volunteered to assist with my tuition. She had very little money now. Despite the fact that she was barely making ends meet, she promised to find a solution. She even went so far as to seek assistance from some of her closest friends. They contributed as well, and they managed to make it happen. It was plenty to get me started, but it wasn't a whole ride. I can still clearly recall that moment, examining the checks her friends had written out for me while sitting in her little disorganized kitchen and reviewing the money. It was among the most humble things I have ever done. Even though they hardly knew me, these individuals had greater faith in me than my own father did. I immediately made a commitment to myself that I would make every dollar matter, that their trust in me would not be squandered. I thus enrolled in college with a computer science concentration. Finally, being able to study what I loved was incredible. I stayed focused, put in a lot of effort, and learned as many skills as I could. The instructors were excellent. The atmosphere was motivating, and I felt as though I had finally found my calling. I didn't feel like I had to work so hard to prove myself for the first time. I also began working on a few side projects when I was in college. Between school, homework, and part-time jobs, I had been holding on to an idea for a long that I believed might have a significant impact on the IT industry. I put all of my free time on this project, chipping away at it. It wasn't simple. It was tough to juggle everything, but I was committed to making it work. In hindsight, that time in my life marked a sea change. Every late night, every weekend spent coding rather than going out, and every penny I managed to scrounge together was contributing to a greater goal. Even if she didn't quite get what I was doing, my aunt was there to support me through it all. She would inquire. Although she couldn't understand the technical language, she was really fascinated. I persevered just because I knew she was on my side. I wish I could claim that this entire event strengthened me, but it also left a mark. I no longer had any expectations of my brother or father. I came to the realization that they would never be the sort of family that would provide me with the necessary support. That was painful. Indeed, it infuriated me. However, it also encouraged me to demonstrate that I could succeed without their blessing. I eventually saved up enough money from side jobs and freelancing to partially reimburse my Aunt Dot. She would always argue that it wasn't required and that she was simply glad to see me doing well, even though I would hand her an envelope each month with what I could afford. But when no one else would, I claimed that she had given me a chance. I also couldn't ignore that. I had a functional app prototype by the time I was almost done with my degree. I put all I had into it in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, it would be the thing that made me stand out, to prove to myself and maybe even to my dad, though he would never know that I was worth betting on. But I kept it a secret, mostly because I didn't want to raise my expectations. I spent those years living that way. I was attempting to make ends meet while coding in college. I wouldn't exchange it for anything, even if it wasn't easy. I got closer to being someone I was proud of with each step I made and obstacle I overcame, even if it was invisible to those who should have cared the most. In hindsight, the outcome is almost comical. The man who was informed that his dreams were pointless, who, after being rejected by his own father, went on to forge his own way. It was in spite of my family, not because of them, and in some way, that added to its satisfaction. Graduation passed by quickly. It finally paid off after all those years of arduous labor, late evenings, and all-nighters. From the young man hiding in his room to escape his own family, I felt like I'd gone a long way. My app was finished, polished, and functioning properly by that point. My aunt was the only member of my family I had yet to tell about it. She was excited for me, even if she didn't completely get what I had done. Even if it was just her saying, "I'm proud of you." That type of encouragement meant a lot. I made the decision to fully invest in my app when I graduated. I felt like I finally had something that may have an effect, even if it was a risk, and I knew it could go either way. Even though I was a nobody in the field, I reasoned that since I had already worked so hard, there was no danger in pushing myself further. I'd figure out a means to get back up if it didn't work. Whether it was successful. I was eager to find out, even though I had no idea what it might look like yet. I began modestly by presenting my software to a few nearby businesses. I can't even begin to count the number of times I was rejected, but I persisted even though the majority of them didn't bite. By gradually making improvements and taking constructive criticism to heart, that perseverance began to pay off in unexpected ways. Some folks tried it out and found it to be enjoyable. Slowly, word got out. People were contacting me before I even realized it. But more than any of the early victories, there was this one instance that sticks out. One late night, while I was totally focused on my job, my phone buzzed. A larger IT business sent the email. It's not huge, but it's big enough that if they were interested, they could really help me. To be sure I wasn't dreaming, I must have read the email 100 times. They desired a meeting as soon as possible. I recall feeling as though things were finally going my way as I sat in my tiny apartment and stared at the TV. All those years of working as a hearing tech are either a hobby or a return to me. However, they didn't sting this time. I came to the realization that I no longer required anyone's approval. This was something I was doing for myself, and it was effective. I was more anxious than I'd like to confess before that encounter. I had never before made a proposal to a business this large. I demonstrated the capabilities of my program to them. I tried my best to mask my nervousness while explaining how it resolved some important issues they had been having. The meeting's facilitator leaned back, gave me a look and said, "I think we can work something out." I had to force myself not to smile foolishly. My first major break came from that deal. Although it didn't make me a billionaire overnight or anything, it was sufficient to establish my reputation and increase the number of people who saw my app. After that, everything went off more quickly than I could have ever imagined. Other businesses began contacting me, and all of a sudden I had more tasks than I could handle. Then the money began to flow in. Not a lot of money at first, but enough to help my aunt with her bills, pay off some of my college loans, and eventually find a respectable place to live. I left my little apartment and moved into a place where I didn't have to continuously avoid shattered windows and leaking pipes. For the first time in my life, I truly felt secure and as like I was creating something long-lasting. Although I would want to claim that I was happy with it, I just kept my head down and concentrated on my task. To be honest, though, I felt a need to show my brother and father what I had achieved. Since leaving home, I hadn't spoken to any of them, and from what I understood, they hadn't made an effort to get in touch either. I wanted them to know that I had achieved something, even though I knew it was insignificant, that I hadn't been hampered by their lack of encouragement, but I remained at a distance. If I did contact out, I was worried that they would somehow turn it around, make it look like I owed them anything, or worse, minimize what I had done. I refused to give them the opportunity. I concentrated on my job, expanded my clientele, and continued to improve my app. I used my funds wisely to hire a few freelancers and purchase some equipment to assist the app's functionality grow. I had learned to trust my gut at that point, but it was still a leap of faith. The investment paid off, and I soon found myself earning more than I ever imagined. I still recall the day I achieved my first significant accomplishment. I just inked a big contract with a business that wants to integrate my software with their own systems. This agreement was significant enough to make me famous and give me the type of credibility I had only ever imagined. Although I didn't exactly have someone with whom to celebrate, I still wanted to do it. My college pals had dispersed, leaving me essentially alone. However, my aunt was ecstatic when I informed her. She even organized a small gathering with a few of her friends who had helped me over my academic career. I suppose that what I truly desired was for someone in my family, other than my aunt, to take notice and recognize that I had accomplished something significant. However, I knew in my heart that it would never occur. It still stung that they wouldn't notice the part of me that was at last flourishing, even though I had shown myself that I could achieve without them. Things continued to expand over the following several months. After my software became popular, I was put in a situation I never would have imagined. Financially secure with room to grow and make investments in new initiatives. It seemed unreal. Transforming from the insignificant child to a person who could truly change things. Even if I no longer need approval, the past still had wounds. They wrote me off, and I still felt like the outsider. But in spite of everything, I had a strange calm. Without my brother's or dad's consent, I had created something from the ground up. I had forged my own success and discovered my own way, and it was their fault, not mine, if they didn't care. I had finally come to terms with the fact that that chapter of my life was coming to an end. I was at last feeling at home after all the effort I had put into getting here. I had my own home, a good setup, and enough success with the app that I didn't have to worry about security or costs. It was a pleasant sensation. It was one I had never really known. At last, I had my life back on track. I also felt like I had nothing to prove to anyone, for once. You can only imagine how shocked I was when my brother and father arrived at my workplace one evening. No heads up, no warning. Just them, seeming as though they had been invited, standing at my door. I assumed it was one of my staff members because I had been working late, or even the housekeeping staff. When I opened the door, I saw my brother attempting to be calm, but appearing just as uneasy as my dad, who was looking a bit sheepish. I was kind of startled as I simply gazed at them. It resembled ghost sightings. After all these years without receiving any calls, texts, or anything else, they stood in my office as if it were the most commonplace thing in the world. I briefly believed that I may be dreaming. I was at a loss for words. They just waited for me to extend an invitation to enter. After a while, I moved aside to allow them in, mostly due to shock. They entered and surveyed the room as if attempting to gauge my level of success. Although it wasn't very large, my workplace was pleasant. I had worked hard and saved my own money to get to where I was. I frequently met with clients in a little lounge area, and they would sit there looking very uncomfortable and out of place. We heard about your achievement, my dad added, clearing his throat after a few seconds of quiet. We decided to swing over and check in because it was time. He made an effort to grin, but it fell short of his eyes. He seemed uneasy to me, perhaps even a bit intimidated. In contrast, my brother appeared to be struggling to keep his composure. His look showed it to me. Being there didn't exactly excite him. I didn't know how to react. In an attempt to maintain a neutral expression, I simply nodded and took a seat across from them. Seeing them here, finally admitting what I had done, made me feel a strange mixture of feelings, including perplexity, wrath, and perhaps even a little satisfaction. However, I maintained my composure and simply waited for them to speak whatever they had decided to say. My dad struck up a conversation by inquiring about the app and the state of the company. Hearing him show interest, as if he had always been encouraging, was strange. I gave him little to work with in my brief but courteous answers to his queries. I felt a tiny, trivial sense of satisfaction when I saw that he was having trouble carrying on the discussion. He was attempting to play the proud father. But it didn't sit well after all the years he had been disregarding me here. My brother finally got in after a few minutes of this awkward back and forth. The casual chat didn't disturb him. Straight to the point, he remarked, "Look, we need your help." I was happy he had said it, but my dad gave him a glare, presumably irritated that he had been so direct. At least we were finally approaching the true purpose of their visit. As I waited for him to continue, I arched an eyebrow. He fiddled with his hands while looking down before beginning to explain. Evidently, his life had not been going so well. He was having trouble making ends meet because his work didn't pay well. In addition, he had accrued some debt, which my dad had been assisting him with for some time, but it had become too much. They came to me in the hopes that I might help them out since they were in a difficult situation. I had to suppress a chuckle. They came here to plead for my assistance after years of being disregarded and treated like outsiders. I was astounded by the boldness. However, I remained as expressionless as possible and simply listened as my father attempted to explain that this was some sort of family emergency and that it was my responsibility to intervene. I simply sat there staring at them when he was done. They returned the look, presumably anticipating that I would say yes and intervene to rescue the day. However, I didn't. "Why me?" I questioned, leaning back and crossing my arms. "For years, you people have shown little interest in my work or in me. Why do you think I would want to assist right now?" My father shuffled uneasily, attempting to think of anything to say. He began by saying something about forgiveness and family unity. However, I didn't purchase it. He ignored my interest, put my brother before me, and refused to pay for my education for all those years. All of them were racing through my head. I understood that their purpose for coming was not to make apologies. They needed something, which is why they were here. I laid everything out in a cool, collected manner and informed them as much. "S funny, you know," I remarked. "You folks were nowhere to be seen when I needed help while I was having trouble. Both of you pretended that I didn't exist. now that I've achieved success, all of a sudden, you recall me. When times are tough, I'm not your fallback option. My father attempted to break the silence by stating that things weren't like that and that they had always cared, if perhaps not outwardly. Okay. When my brother added that things have been difficult for him, it all seemed like justifications. They hadn't helped me for years, and I wasn't going to allow it to happen again. Guilt me into solving their issues right now. I informed them that without assistance from any of you, I had worked too hard to reach this point. I know nothing about you. Their expressions were priceless. My brother was silent for once and just glanced at the floor while my dad appeared to have been smacked. I could see the awareness that I had moved on without them and that I wasn't going to save them. Shortly after they departed, with my dad muttering something about family loyalty and giving it some thought, keeping my distance, I simply nodded and watched them go to the door. I experienced a curious spectrum of feelings as they left, including a surprised sense of calm, a great deal of relief, and a little amount of rage. After years of feeling like I had to prove myself to them, I finally understood that I didn't require their affirmation or approval. It was sufficient that I'd done it alone. I sat in my office for a while after they departed, simply thinking. I was okay with the fact that they would most likely never get in touch with me again. I didn't need them to be a part of my life anymore. I felt liberated for the first time, without their expectations, without their judgment, and I was free to be who I truly wanted to be. I needed the closure, even if it wasn't the reunion I had hoped for.